This had happened before. For 2 or 3 weeks in July, tiny beetles appeared on the trees, mountain pine beetles. They would hatch from a tree they'd just killed, then swarm a new one to start their life cycle all over again. But now, instead of the usual 2 weeks, you can spot them from May through October. They fly non-stop, attacking trees, chewing through the bark, and laying eggs inside. The beetles don't care if the trees are young or old, plus they're climbing to heights that were previously unimaginable. Once, low temperatures kept beetles away from high altitudes, but now they swarm and kill trees even at the tops of mountains. The result is terrifying. Across the western part of North America, from Mexico to Alaska, forests are dying off on an unprecedented scale. Nothing like this has been recorded in the past 150 years, maybe even longer. In total, more than 70,000 square miles of forest have died in the Rocky Mountains of Canada and the United States since 2000. Just to give you an idea, that's an area the size of Washington state. The growing swath of dead pine forests might be upsetting or even scary, but some forest experts are actually happy about this phenomenon. It's as if, for the first time in the history of our planet, we're facing a situation where a dead forest is actually a good thing. I guess I'll need some coffee. Here's the most unobtrusive reminder in the world. Not a request, just a reminder for those who forget to hit the like button. Don't forget to do it at the end of watching or while you're watching. So what are we dealing with here? Environmental experts have spoken more than once about forest restoration on our planet, and in their opinion, this is one of the greatest environmental problems of the 21st century. But the problem isn't at all that forests are being ruthlessly cut down, as you might think. The problem is specifically with planting trees. People are pretty actively doing it, even making long-term plans. But 45% of the promised new forests will be monoculture plantations of fast-growing trees. To put it simply, people take trees that grow especially fast and plant them wherever they want. This seems like reforestation, but that's a fundamentally wrong interpretation of the term. And this is despite the fact that throughout the entire 20th century, the U.S. Forest Service was planting trees. They would take a plot of land cleared by fire or clear cutting, and every 10 or 11 feet, they'd stick a new pine in the ground. So as you can see, this resulted in neat rows of young trees. No natural forest grows like that. It's more like a cornfield, with pines instead of corn. Yet in the last 100 years, this has become the industry standard. Everyone planted trees this way because that's how pines grew the quickest. But not to turn into a forest, but to be made into someone's furniture. This kind of planting has reached such scales that by 2011, Europe and North America ran out of space to plant new trees, so companies started moving production to developing countries in the global south. Usually, governments support this model of investment, production, and consumption, and the model really does look attractive because companies don't cut down local forests, but instead plant their own trees that suit them. After a few years, companies come back, cut down the trees, plant new ones, and it goes in a circle, bringing in a decent amount of money to the state budgets. The problem is that companies always plant those monoculture forests, meaning forests made up of just one specific type of tree. As a result, instead of a full-fledged forest, you get what experts call green deserts. These green deserts are gradually encroaching on fertile soils because the plantations are getting bigger, trees are needed for producing pulp and paper, well, and for other industrial purposes too. And although monoculture forests are usually seen as something good because they're green and pretty, in reality, these forests are just dead inside. No one lives there. You won't hear a single bird if you get closer. But it'd be okay if it was just about the lack of birds and other animals. Sometimes the effects of planting monoculture of trees are way worse. One of those examples is Canada. Back in the early 1990s, Canada was busy replanting its lands with new trees as part of its forest restoration efforts. The responsibility for restoration was largely handed over to logging companies, meaning those people who had contracts for timber harvesting. They just had to invest in reforestation, and they got the chance to cut down a huge amount of trees. Back then, nobody thought about what consequences this might lead to. They didn't keep us waiting. In April 2016, a powerful forest fire almost obliterated the Canadian oil town of Fort McMurray, burning down 2,400 homes and making nearly 100,000 people flee for safety. Back then, about 1.5 million acres burned to the ground, and the damage amounted to $7.4 billion. The fire became the most expensive disaster in Canadian history, but at the same time gave people a reason to think. Soon it became clear that both the damage and the fire itself would have been much less if the forest that caught fire had consisted of different types of trees. But they were just packed with super flammable spruce trees. Essentially, the fire was caused by a failed forest planting campaign run by the government. The idea, as usual, was good, plant trees, but people did it on land that used to be swamps, which they drained beforehand. As a result, the new firs sucked up groundwater, growing unusually wide canopies that simply choked out the peat moss. Another, drier kind took its place, which became kindling instead of a fireproof agent. Dry moss plus spruce trees, which burn really well, that's the recipe for disaster. But the most terrible thing is that the fires in Fort McMurray were by no means the only instance of large-scale tree planting leading to the exact opposite result. I guess it's about time to figure out what the issue is with monoculture forests. First and foremost, it's definitely the wildfires. Experts say the monoculture of trees, for example, seedlings of black spruce which were planted in Canada 6 feet apart in neat rows, has made forest fires more likely and much more serious. This very black spruce burns so well that firefighters even call such trees gas on a stick. You could say these trees evolved to burn. I'm serious. They have flammable sap, and the resin-filled cones open up when heated to drop seeds into the charred soil. Add climate change to the scenario, and the forest will turn into real time bombs waiting to go off. Dry conditions, midday heat, and strong winds, and just like that, the forest is on fire, spreading further at a terrifying speed. In a natural forest, black spruce often grows mixed with trees like aspen and poplar, which are full of moisture, making them naturally fire-resistant. But when a lot of black spruces gather in one spot, a local forest fire can blow up to apocalyptic proportions. The same goes for ponderosa pines, which are being planted just as actively. Such plantings are incredibly fire-prone until they reach about 60 to 80 years old. At that age, the trees become large enough that their crowns are out of the reach of fire, but until then, a pine plantation can't stand up to a fire at all. One spark is enough and the trees will burst into flames like matches, tall, resinous matches. But the wildfires are just the first problem of monoculture forests. Another, no less serious issue, is the impact of these forests on meadows and prairies, and on water. Pine and even eucalyptus plantations can dry out groundwater streams and even entire rivers. That's why ecologists say that monoforests always mean death for meadows, because the light needed for grass growth is simply blocked, not to mention the moisture. Meadows pretty much work like sponges, soaking up all the water that lands on them. That moisture then seeps into the ground, keeping everything balanced. Everyone's happy. That's why the loss of meadows inevitably results in floods and soil erosion. In the woods themselves, apart from the trees, there's practically nothing else growing, so nothing really happens. It's like the scenery of some city in a movie set. On the surface, everything seems natural, but if you look closely, you see that no one actually lives here. Because monoculture forests literally reduce biodiversity instead of increasing it. They create very harsh conditions, and the number of species that can survive in such conditions is limited. Part of the reason is that the planted trees often aren't native to the country where they're planted. This can also reduce the extent to which the forest can support other life. Plus, the trees are planted at the same time, which means there's almost no difference in their growth, and under such conditions, lighting really suffers. Very few plants can live and thrive in low light, not to mention the soil issues. And don't forget about diseases. Replacing natural forests with even-aged monocultures can remove many natural limitations for local pests and pathogens. This immediately increases the risk of all sorts of forest epidemics. Just imagine you're a beetle or some kind of fungus that specializes, well, for example, on spruces. Usually spruces don't grow tightly together, so when you eat one, you have to make an effort to get to a new one. Sometimes it takes so much effort that it becomes impossible. Too many unsuitable trees in the way. But if you find yourself in a monoculture forest, literally everything around you is a potential buffet or a great place to start a family. This means that the uniformity of species and the closeness of the trees contribute to the rapid spread of parasites and various diseases. There are also serious risks for businesses. As I mentioned, trees are usually planted to eventually make a profit, but the risk of not getting anything at all, just losses, is really high. This has happened before, and not just once. Monoculture forests get sick, and owners of specific plots rush to cut down and sell the dead and sick trees, but there are thousands of these owners, and in the end, it leads to a market crash. But there's one place on the planet where a monoculture forest is dying, and ecologists are genuinely happy about it. Maybe it's the only place where a dead forest means something good. Not too long ago, Germany's wooded areas looked like this, in the spirit of a Brothers Grimm tale. But nowadays, the forest looks totally different. To figure out why it happened, the ranger doesn't have to search long. It's enough to go up to the nearest spruce, and he'll notice holes in its bark. Those are made by the bark beetle, which has invaded the entire area. Rangers say it's become a regular thing to find dying or dead trees every day these past few years. And while forests still cover a third of the country, according to the latest federal government study, 79% of the trees are sick, dying, or already dead. It's really a depressing picture. The gray or even white trees without leaves look like the skeletons of mythical monsters, and the huge clearings where the forest used to be bring to mind a bomb that wiped everything out. Except the bomb has nothing to do with it. It's the bugs. These insects bore holes in trees, and then they release pheromones to attract a mate. The partners are drawn in, mating happens, after which the females lay eggs inside the tree. Unfortunately, the life cycle of the beetles doesn't end there. One pair of insects can produce up to 1,000 offspring in just 1 year. As a result, the beetles spread through the forest just as quickly as a fire. This partly happens because a quarter of Germany's forests are, or used to be, spruces. They were planted as part of a reforestation in the 19th century and after World War II. At that time, Germany was paying off some of its reparations to other countries with trees and needed timber to rebuild its own cities. The answer was clear: plant more spruces wherever they could. The regions where deciduous trees such as beech and oak grew naturally were replaced with fast-growing firs and pines. These trees became so vital to Germany's economy that they were called bread trees. No one considered adding some diversity. Are there trees? Yes, there are. For decades, the program looked like an overwhelming success. Since the 1950s, timber stocks have only increased. By the early 21st century, the total number of trees in German forests reached a volume not seen since the Middle Ages. It's not surprising, since they mainly planted spruce. Spruce grows fast. It produces straight, quality timber that can be used for nearly any purpose, from crafting furniture to making paper. But what made spruce such a ridiculously profitable wood also made it quite vulnerable. Forests all around the world are suffering from droughts and storms, and Germany's no exception. All this has seriously damaged the root systems of the spruces, and the trees have lost their ability to draw enough water from the ground. Spruce trees, when compared to other trees, need quite a bit of water to grow, while they have a small root system that can't reach water deep underground. Additionally, in Germany, a lot of spruces were planted at much lower heights than they naturally grow. So spruces definitely grow in Germany, but overall, they're not very comfortable. The trees are already weakened, and then the beetles come and finish them off. Healthy trees usually produce resin that fills holes, thus protecting the spruces from bugs, but weak trees don't have the resources to make that resin. You see this area? Just 5 years ago, it was completely covered with trees. A year ago, it got infested with bark beetles, and that's it. Today, there are no more trees. Because beetles don't just eat the bark, they actually chew through the layers of wood that are responsible for transporting nutrients and water up the trunk. So the tree that's infested with beetles might look fine, but in reality, it's slowly dying of thirst and hunger. This process can't be reversed, and the only option for an infested tree is to cut it down. And that's how many beetles you can see in a special trap. A 2-ounce cup can hold 40 beetles. The trap has enough beetles to fill dozens of such cups because there are 2,000 of them. The more spruce trees there are, the more beetles show up, and the harder the forest gets hit. Since 2018, over 740,000 acres of trees in Germany, more than 2.5% of the country's total forest area, have died due to beetles and drought. When forest rangers find a tree infected by beetles, they mark it with a special paint. Then, to contain the infestation, the tree is cut down as quickly as possible. And since it's never just one tree that gets infected, you end up with these patches of cut-down trees. It looks damn sad. But even despite all this, the forest rangers in national parks where thousands of spruce trees have been destroyed see the beetle not just as a pest, but also as a savior. No, they haven't lost their minds. Follow the thought. People planted a bunch of spruce trees that didn't do nature any good, but rather caused a lot of harm. Now the beetle has eaten these spruce trees and, it simply freed nature from artificial plantations. The old spruce trees are gone and people are letting nature do its thing. On the freed up land, nobody is planting anything anymore, and plants are popping up and spreading by themselves. Amazing. But nature is great at restoring forests when people don't interfere. This area, for example, looked completely dead just 2 years ago, but today there's grass, shrubs, and young trees. You can even hear the birds singing. It's the birds, along with the wind, that help the trees seed the newly freed land. And dead trees, if left alone, provide habitats for insects. They also provide shade, shelter, retain moisture, and even break down to bring benefits. Overall, the forest workers say that in 10 to 20 years, there'll be a genuine natural forest here, grown according to the rules. Biodiversity and all that. You know what I mean. So dying forests consisting of just one kind of tree are actually good because they provide a chance to create new, healthy forests. The key is to not interfere. Well, okay, the important thing is to act according to the circumstances because different parts of the national park where the spruce trees died react differently. In some places, nature manages to recover on its own, but in others, human help wouldn't hurt. So the park employees are still planting trees on the grounds, just now they're using different kinds. Mainly those that used to grow here before people planted spruce trees everywhere they could. So actually, it's not necessary to do this at all. And the forest will appear in these places eventually, just not anytime soon. But people are terribly impatient, so they decided to speed up the process, even though it's tough. Before planting anything, you need to understand which trees will work for this land. They create special plots planted with different types of trees, something like a forest test area. Then scientists closely observe this test area to understand which trees are best suited for planting. In this area, for example, scientists are testing beech, oak, and plane trees that are well adapted to life in lowlands and that can easily get by with little water, which they can draw from deep underground. Of course, working with different tree species is more complicated and expensive. They all have different risks and costs, but there's simply no other way. The stakes are high not only for nature. Germany's forestry sector generates around $170 billion annually and provides jobs for over 1.1 million people. If we keep working the same way as before, forests will keep getting smaller despite all the planting. And that means losses and lost jobs. Basically, you see what I mean. Good news, it looks like the new German approach could be used globally in all places where forests have been cut down or have died. So maybe the U.S. should also consider forest extinction as an opportunity, not a disaster. Bad news, the problem of mass forest loss could get worse. In 1969, the bond signatories were signed. Dozens of countries committed to stopping the loss of their natural forests and started the restoration of degraded farmland. That does sound good. And the goal is a noble one. By 2030 to cover 865 million acres with forests and arable land, which is more than the size of India. The first country to fulfill its commitments under the bond signatories was Pakistan. India is lagging just a bit behind and is already actively restoring nearly 24.7 million acres. A similar situation is seen in China. Between 2000 and 2014, Latin America planted about 64,500 square miles of forests, which is roughly equal to the size of Syria. And all of this sounded good. Right up until we started making this video. I really hope they approach the planting wisely and are planting different kinds of trees, creating a real forest, but there's still a risk that the problem with firs or pines might happen again. We can only wait and hope. This is called blackmail. In 1999, Beijing banned further logging on Chinese soil and launched the Conversion of Cropland to Forest program, sometimes called Grain for Green. It seemed like nothing could go wrong. Today, authorities claim that the program has paid over 100 million farmers across the country. This was money for planting trees. It's also claimed that nearly 69 million acres of forest have been restored. The effectiveness of the program has often been questioned, partly because no one cared about the diversity of trees. Instead, traditional biodiversity systems have been replaced by eucalyptus and rubber monocultures. But that's not too bad. What do you think of the news that many farmers who took money for planting trees on their land said they would cut them down again? And they'll do it as soon as the government stops paying them. 82% of harm. While the bond signatories obviously have good intentions, many details of its implementation are questionable. Recent analysis and research have shown that in Brazil, for instance, 82% of the promised restoration is really just monoculture plantations. This is not a natural forest at all. See for yourself. On the left is how the forest is supposed to look, and on the right is what it looks like in Brazil. You don't need to be an ecologist or a forester to understand the difference, and the main thing is it's not just about the damage to nature. Monoculture eucalyptus plantations, which are exactly what they're planning in Brazil, take over the land of the indigenous people of the country, displacing them. This leads to entire poverty belts with all the resulting issues like crime. In short, the bond signatories perfectly illustrate the saying, "We wanted the best, you know the rest." Need more seedlings. Not long ago, it became known that the U.S. plans for reforestation due to climate change are facing a serious problem. And no, it's not monocultures, which are bad for everyone. It's the shortage of seedlings. In an effort to cut carbon emissions and provide relief from extreme heat, governments across the country have committed to planting trees. And soon a study came out showing that the U.S. just doesn't have enough seedlings to save the planet, even on the scale of just one country. American nurseries are growing too few trees to do everything that's been planned on paper. They also lack the variety of plant species needed for the plans to work. I hope no one's going to plant all the available spruce trees. Forest chill. Even though climate change is ramping up the heat in the U.S., several eastern states remain surprisingly cool. This riddle has long baffled scientists, as no one could clearly explain what makes these states so unique. It was only in March 2024 that a study emerged, providing a little insight into the situation. It seems that forest regeneration is partly responsible for the coolness. Many of the lush forests that now grow in the eastern United States didn't exist 2 centuries ago. Actually, they were here long before, but in the late 18th century, European settlers were actively cutting them down. By the early 20th century, in some forests that had existed for thousands of years, only 10% of the trees remained. Land clearing eventually slowed down by the early 1900s, partly because there was just nothing left to cut. Then, farmland was abandoned because people were moving to growing cities or migrating west in search of a better life. This gave trees a chance to grow back, and millions of acres of forest returned during the 20th century. Nobody tried to cut them down anymore. At the same time, burning fossil fuels began raising temperatures across the entire U.S., except for a significant part of the southeastern and central regions. Why? Maybe we can really thank the forests and luck that they managed to grow before we started overheating the planet. Well, you owe me a like. See you later.